The question we are to discuss is, what is the effect of the role of the place of campaigning on television, whether it's possible, whether it isn't possible. And in a sense, what I'd like to do is just start with the panel to discuss our respective experience of trying to influence the way people think through our films. Havana, let's start with you.
Okay. Afghanistan, I've just made. It was about pop idol in Afghanistan, and before that, a short film that I did that was a direct campaigning film called The Crippendales, about sex and disability. The Crippendales was a directly campaigning film, although I was sort of too inexperienced to really sort of get all the outreach around it going. But the guys in that then did become sort of campaigners and pin-ups for scope.
Briefly describe it. How many people have seen Crippendales?
I'm sure that hardly anyone.
Not many. Oh, okay, just quickly describe it.
Amazing that even it was on midnight. It was about the first group of disabled male strippers called the Crippendales, and we followed them up, obviously, to the final. What that did and what Afghanistan did, which I think is really important in campaigning films, is taking serious, possibly depressing subjects and making them interesting, fun, entertaining, quirky, odd, all the things that makes people watch films, and make them, first and foremost, they're good films. They're not campaigning films. I think that's probably the most important thing. Right, John, you make overtly campaigning films.
Well, I suppose the films that you're referring to were overtly campaigning. Peace One Day and The Day After Peace were done by the same guy, a man called Jeremy Gilley. Peace One Day was his attempts to get the global community to sanction an official ceasefire day via the UN, and The Day After Peace was a film in which he went out and tried to actually have a ceasefire implemented. And then the film I made with Franny Armstrong this year is called The Age of Stupid, which is a film about climate change, global warming, 5 interweaving stories, all pointed towards how we're destroying the planet. I think from the point of view of my company, Passion Pictures, and me and why we made those films, it's as much about, it becomes about the subject matter, the campaign, and for us it's always, we always approach it in terms of making these films in as broad a way as possible to try and find as big an audience as possible, and in terms of the actual campaign, you know, it's really, that's what's most important. The campaign is a central part of the film, but we're always attempting to make films that will appeal to as broad an audience as possible. We started with a film called One Day in September, and that just sort of set the tone for us. And so what gets me going is if someone approaches us with something that we as a company feel passionately about, campaign or not, as it happens. But in terms of those 3 campaigning films, I just thought, you know, it was a no-brainer for me, particularly in our business, to be involved in films that at their core had something that felt so important above and beyond the film business or the documentary business, was what made us want to make those films, and then want to try and maximize their impact in any way we could.
Okay, before I come to you, Hamish, just quickly, who paid for yours? I mean, I think I know the answer, but explain how you sold them. Did you sell them as campaign films or just good stories?
No, just good stories. Afghanistan was more for, with private money, BritDoc, and the only one that's vaguely controversial is the DFID, Commonwealth Broadcasting Association, gave us a bit of development cash as well.
How about percentage?
Small.
Right. Did it affect the way you made the film?
No, it didn't.
Okay. And who's paid for yours?
Well, from a broadcaster point of view, the BBC put money into the 2 Peace films, and Age of Stupid was privately financed. Yeah. Private individuals. How
many of you have seen Age of Stupid and have been solicited by Franny? Because she's a brilliant hustler as well. Okay, so it's interesting though. Here's a constituency of committed people, and only a
No, but this is, yeah, I mean...
No, but come on.
No, you're right.
You know,
interesting is one word for it. Well, I can think of a few others.
All right, fair enough, okay. Now, Hamish, when somebody comes to you with something that has campaigning elements, right? I know you're going to want a good film, so, but how do you feel in Channel 4 feel about that campaigning question? What's your view about that?
Well, I mean, there's two opinions about whether this is a golden age for campaigning films or whether campaigning films are on the skids. I mean, from my point of view, what's really good about campaigning films just now, to some extent, is that they're an area where Channel 4 can really feel distinct from other channels. The BBC can't do them so easily because of the, as you know, the extending tentacles of editorial policy creeping into everything. Other channels don't particularly want to do them, so the more campaigning films we do, the more kind of 4-ish we feel. And so I mean, I've got a really big appetite for campaigning films at the moment, and they work terrifically well, particularly on Unreported World does well. We can put them into prime time on Channel 4. Also, True Stories on More 4 is doing a lot of campaigning films, and really, they really are performing well there in terms of how they're regarded. Yeah.
I mean, one interesting question about this, and for all of us really, is whether we see television as the beginning of a campaign or the climax of a campaign. Whether that, whether you want to get it funded, which is great, but it's a question of, if you take More 4 as an example, the audience is small, but to get it made, to have it shown there, is a kind of calling card, isn't it? I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing for Channel 4 is we've got to safeguard our own editorial independence. We've also got to kind of illustrate due impartiality on these things. So we can provide a platform for your campaign, but we can't be your campaign. And I think that's a distinction which sometimes can get a little bit muddied. And I also think that there are kind of do's and don'ts, which we can talk about in due course, for how you go about getting the most for your campaign out of the broadcaster, and also letting the broadcaster feel that your campaign will be the right thing for them. You sometimes get terrible clashes between campaigners and broadcasters. Some campaigning filmmakers see the world in rather binary terms, and they tend to think if you're not with them, then you're against them. And the channel that might be doing them quite a lot of good, because it won't get out there kind of knocking on doors and leafleting for their campaign, then is kind of part of the enemy. They're the man, if you like.
That's a very interesting point, because you're right about the BBC, but they also have done, I mean, this is true, everybody knows. I mean, just again, a show of hands, how many people know who editorial policy are at the BBC and have had run-ins with them? Get a very small number. Okay, so then you should just, these are people who are not lawyers, although some of them are ex-lawyers, or you can't be an ex-lawyer, I suppose. But certainly that's not a way of giving up law to go into that. It's spreading. It's that famous HLA Hart debate with Devlin about the morality of law. They move from the literal question about law to the moral spirit of it, which is much woollier and really difficult stuff. But the interesting thing is that even though they are being ultra cautious after Queen Gate and Jonathan Ross and so on, they did do, is it called Headspace? Does anyone remember? For the last 2 years they've been campaigning to raise awareness about mental health and mental illness, and it's, to their great credit, the Stephen Fry films and others, they have really done, and the local radio and local television campaigns that the BBC have done in that space are fantastic.
But then it's not a controversial issue. Nobody's going to say, let's not raise awareness about mental health issues. Yeah. It's when you get into campaigns where there are two very distinct sides that the broadcaster has to be slightly more up for it.
Like climate change.
Well, it's a good example.
Right. How many people saw the Great Climate Change Swindle? Or is it called that swindle?
Great Global Warming Swindle.
Global Warming Swindle. Okay. Again, you guys don't watch television. Do you want to describe that quickly?
Well, I mean, it's amazing how this was a film from 2.5 years ago nearly now, and still burns pretty brightly in everyone's memory. Probably the most divisive film that I've ever been involved in terms of how polarized the reaction to it was. From my point of view, if you really are going to do these sort of Channel 4 things of providing space for alternative voices, and being the home of challenging perspectives, you have to kind of believe in what you say, and you can't always simply make films which are campaigning films about things that people in this room would agree with, or a certain cadre of people who live in Islington and Crouch End would agree with, or even to that matter, you can't say, I believe in freedom of speech for me and for people who kind of believe in what I say, but not for others. And I think that if you have a debate where there is a credible point of view, which is highly underrepresented, but is clearly sort of significant and represented by people who are credible, then the argument for making a film that represents that that point of view is pretty powerful. It's a pretty fundamental free speech argument that that view should be represented. So we made a film which effectively showcased the viewpoints of people who don't believe that anthropogenic global warming, that anthropogenic CO2 is the cause of global warming. And kind of all hell broke loose, really, and is still rumbling on.
Yes, there was an argument also about the science, that in a sense that I think the argument was partly about the facts. And just to sort of put my point of view about this, and I haven't talked to the panel about it, so I'm contributing in that sense to the discussion even as the chair, is that in the rape film that I made that changed the way people handled rape, there was a campaign going on, and all we did was provide the evidence. And to me, that's the kind of campaigning film that I like doing, because I want the campaign to start when it goes on television, or not start, but the argument, if you like, to move on using the evidence we provided. And we made a film in the last referendum by the EU about how we were inside the EU, and depending on your point of view, it was used either to show how clumsy the EU was and it didn't get anything done because they consulted everybody, or how fair it was by consulting everybody. And I like the fact that people can use the same evidence, because then I can have a point of view about it, which I do, but it's not in the film. The film is there to present evidence, which is a kind of meat for the argument and meant to provoke an argument. John, how was, I mean, given that your films, the peace films, have they been on telly yet? Or
they have, yeah. They have.
What was the difference between showing it, as it were, to an audience at a film festival and on television? What was the feedback?
The feedback's always fantastic, and yeah, in terms of the audiences who see those films, the feedback is always fantastic. They're very, it's kind of impossible to watch this guy travel around the world trying to get support, getting when he gets the day sanctioned in the first film, and watching everything that he goes. It's impossible not to be affected by it, not to be moved by it. Likewise,
who's against peace? I mean,
what's that?
The pro-war faction.
Yes, exactly. And then in the second film, when he has the ceasefire implemented, it's extremely powerful. And I have to say, when he first came to see me, when he pitched Peace One Day, I can't remember the names myself. When he pitched Peace One Day, he came into my room, to the office, and said, "Look, 10-minute spiel. He's kind of brilliant at doing. He said, "This is the film I want to make." And I said, "Well, sounds really interesting, but really interested, but I'm, I don't think it's for me. I'm not interested." 7 years later, I was still part of the campaign making the second film, because actually, A, it's incredibly compelling, and second of all, like I said, I found, and I still find, when one works in the industry that we work in, and at the time I was trying to work more in the movie business than the documentary business. Someone comes to you and says, "Look, I want to make a film about trying to create a day of peace and see if we can save some lives." And you just think, well, why wouldn't I do that? It's like, it's such a great thing to be.
Reasons.
Well, no.
I mean, no. The reasons, if you're just a commercial company trying to make a living.
But that's the thing we are.
No. Okay. But I mean, if somebody comes in and says, I mean, I have to put my hands up here and say I turned down Man on Wire when it was first brought into me, because I thought it was going to take up all the resources of my company for 4 years, which is, I mean, they went to wall to wall, which had enough resources to give it to them, and great credit to them. And Hassan was kind enough to agree that it probably would have taken up all the films of record. So in a way, when you commit yourself to that, you're not just saying, well, that's one film, that'll be all right.
Well, I suppose, I mean, it slightly depends. I'm not the campaigner, I'm not the filmmaker. In some respects, I'm sort of the facilitator, and therefore, it doesn't mean I have to spend every day of 7 years helping Jeremy make Peace One Day. I can sort of shift around and maneuver and do whatever it is I do to help him get to where he needs to get to.
Okay, a quick question for all of us, and indeed I'll happily bring you guys in shortly, is the question of what price the money is, what's the deal with broadcasters, whether it really compromises you too much if you are a passionate campaigner. Any views about that between the three of you?
It just depends on the deal that you do with the person that gives you the funding, I would say, isn't it? I mean, it depends.
But you also mean creatively, are they going to
I mean, NGOs, for example. There's a lot of money being offered now by NGOs.
Which we're perfectly happy to take.
You are?
Yeah. Bring it on.
As long as you've got editorial control.
Again, I think the BBC have more issues. The BBC have more issues with that sort of thing than you guys do, don't they?
But it depends. There will always have been a discussion about who has editorial, control on it, and whether they.
I have to say, I think that in some respects, it's no different from getting money from whatever financier it is to make another documentary. The truth is, you have to be smart. You have to play the game a bit, which is, you listen to what they tell you they want. You listen to what they tell you they want, and then you do what you want, and you make them think you did what he wanted and what he wanted.
Yes, and it's also about transparency and about being frank about where the money to make the thing actually came from. And I mean, you know, interestingly, we find that some NGOs actually prefer to not to have an on-screen credit, but simply to have their people appear in the film, because they worry that if they've got too clear an on-screen credit, the thing just looks like an infomercial, and it gets devalued as a result of that.
There's a very interesting thing which I only discovered was happening last year, and that is that the Home Office has been putting hundreds of thousands of pounds into films. They did the Border Police one when that was created, and they did the PCSO film, I've forgotten what it's called, the series on was it called Street Cops, something like that, on ITV. They're £800,000, and there's a company in Plymouth that did these series, and I thought, you know, I wrote some piece in Broadcast saying this is outrageous. But when I actually met them, they got one of the directors on. I said, you know, they gave us the money and left us alone.
Yeah.
But PCSOs are a campaigning issue for the government because they're cheaper than cops, you know, full-fledged cops. So in a sense,
you still have to think about it though, because you want them to give you money for the next series, don't you?
well, yeah, but you also want ITV to, or whoever it is. You don't want to be. I mean, it's sort of, I think there's
true.
something in that. But I just found it quite shocking. That, I mean, I'm not sure whether I would ever take that money, even if they said hands off, because it just, you can almost, there's no such thing as a free lunch where I come from, you know. I don't know. Be interested to know. Now look, I want to include people. I kind of feel the itch that people want to contribute in this. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to break the pattern we were supposed to start with. But if you'll forgive me, Hamish, I'm going to start with this the great global warming swindle to see whether there was anybody. Arthur, you were shaking your head when we discussed that. Did you have feelings about that film?
I disagreed slightly with what Hamish was saying about the credibility of the film presented, but it's another discussion.
Right, okay, because I knew there was an issue. Okay, well, hands up. Well, keep going until you guys want. Yes?
No, I was just going to say the thing that you were talking about just then was Beat Life on the Street. And
that was it, Beat Life on the Street.
It was it ended up being Ofcom ended up ruling.
No, did you work on it?
I didn't work on it. No, I've just been reading about it a little bit.
Okay.
They ended up ruling that the relationship between the money contributed and the editorial content had not been clear enough, or that it had not been made clear to the audience, so that in effect the program had been a tool for advocating, as you mentioned, that this was in fact cheaper. I think what was interesting about it was that even though Channel Productions handled on behalf of, I think it was either North 1 or 2/4, but I should...
It's 2/4, I think.
2/4 had actually handled the compliance agreement, and something between the gap in communication between the two, an error had been made, which Ofcom then picked up on. And what I thought was interesting is actually watching the programs as somebody who wasn't aware of the financial relationship before watching them. It didn't appear to me that there was, in fact, I wouldn't have known watching it, and I didn't feel that they had, in fact, gone out there and said, this is really great, these guys do a really good job, and all of this sort of stuff. But I just thought, you know, to contribute to what you were saying. Yeah.
I think it's interesting to note also, in the case of the films, of our films that we're talking about, the BBC talked, I mean, Nick Fraser wanted the BBC to really embrace the two-piece films and really put, you know, all its energy behind it, multi-platform support and all these grand plans. None of it happened because at a certain point within the BBC they weren't prepared to do it. In the case of The Age of Stupid, you know, at a certain point Nick Fraser and Richard Klein were interested in the film, and again, momentarily got very excited about the BBC really embracing it and working with us on the campaigns, etc., etc. That didn't happen at all. They never acquired the film. No one's ever acquired that film. And it's interesting, and it's not directed at you, but not Channel 4. No one at Channel 4 has ever even batted an eyelid in the direction of that film. And I don't, as I said, it's not a complaint. I'm sure there are reasons for it. I'm sure there are probably good reasons for it. But it's interesting that we spent 4 years making that film. Whether it's the perfect film or not, it's an impressive film. Franny as a filmmaker is immense. She's done an incredible job. She's right now in America at the request of Obama's think tank, showing it to God knows who all over America. I mean, it's really, really impressive. And again, whether it's the perfect film or not, you can't not watch that film and come away and think, my God, I've got to do something about this. And for me, as a film producer, and for Passion as a company, that's all that I want out of these films. You know, to be able to have people sit down, watch it, and at the end of it think, well, I really ought to be doing something about it. And I think it is interesting that the broadcasters, you know, I guess ultimately it boils down to ratings. It's about, is this film going to get in a big enough audience? And if it isn't, or if they think it isn't, then it's not of significant interest. I mean, and again, I'm really genuinely not
fair enough.
pointing the finger. It's just a fact.
There may be also something to do with the tone of voice as well. I'll come to you in a second.
Well, you know, it's funny.
Certainly the BBC, probably.
Havana and I were talking earlier about the kind of the buzz of a film. It's incredibly hard beforehand to tell which films are going to take off and which ones aren't. And you know, we were at Sundance talking about Afghan Star, and I was saying, well, there seems to be great buzz about it. We were agreeing there was. We didn't realise that film was just about to kind of rocket into the stratosphere, winning the prizes it won, going on to have the kind of profile that it won. And you know, in some ways, it's honestly true to say that if you actually do a kind of clinical analysis of how much global warming stuff, for example, there is on Channel 4, you'll find that there's an enormous amount of programming that is, in a way, advocating a passionate policy change to prevent carbon dioxide warming the planet. You know, we showed The 11th Hour, which is a really polemical film, in a way quite similar in tone to Age of Stupid, although arguably not quite as well put together. And that film, you know, in prime time on Channel 4, with a huge amount of marketing behind it, just made not a drop in the ocean, just hardly registered a splash. And I don't know quite why that is. Possibly it's to do with the film. Possibly it's to do with the fact that argument is quite well represented in the press, in the newspapers, and so on. And you know, it's just difficult to know what you do with an important issue where there's clearly a kind of viewer fatigue about that issue. You can't just stop representing it, but you have to find new ways to make the viewers come to it. And I think that's the question that we face on a lot of issues, and global warming is kind of one of them.
And actually, I just it's not my place to defend the broadcasters when we've got somebody eloquent
I thought
here.
I said I wasn't attacking them.
No, that's not what I'm saying. No, I'm just defending, as far as, and this was what Havana was saying, we are in a form of show business, right? And so in that sense, if you don't reach people, you're not going to change their minds. And that, I think, is a kind of contradiction we have to live with.
No, but I do slightly feel that at a certain point, and I take the point about climate change or global warming, but at a certain point I feel like, do the broadcasters just have to say, you know what? We're sticking our necks out. We're going to put this on. And it may not get a huge audience. It's had a vast amount of publicity, and we just need to be seen to be supporting it. And I don't know if the answer to that is yes or not.
Hunger is a good example of that, because I don't think it did all that well in ratings, but it was absolutely the most wonderful film. And, you know, you couldn't have predicted that was going to work first time.
No, but you're right about show business, because ultimately, it's all about entertainment. It's all about people wanting to be entertained. And who's going to go and see a film where the title is telling you that you're stupid? You know, possibly not many people. And as we saw here, about 3 hands went up. The film has been in the cinema in a big way in London and across the country. I bet if we asked people here if they'd seen Man on Wire, how many hands would go up?
How many people have seen Man on Wire?
And how many people saw Taxi to the Dark Side? Right. I mean...
Okay, all right.
I mean, I'm not saying that's a ton of people. It isn't a ton of people, but...
No, it's interesting.
But I don't think that should disincentivize us from just making these films.
The point all I'm making is...
That's why, because there are other mediums to show them. I mean, that's why you could, you know, there was a huge amount of press about Age of Stupid, and that's what it's doing. It's campaigning, it's creating the information. So it doesn't have to be on a mainstream broadcaster to create a buzz and to create
No, definitely not.
And we're going to talk about the internet shortly, right? Guerrilla TV, Current TV, all of these things, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, what?
I don't know about them.
Oh, okay, fine. Sorry, you had your hand up first. I'll come to the other. Yes, shout.
Yeah, I was wanting to pick up really some of the things that you've just been discussing. That
you know, what does make a successful film when you look at the balance between infomercial and entertainment, and what do you feel is the compromise that has to be made to make something really entertaining, so you do get the wider audience to actually look at it, but you might have to compromise some of the messages that you really want to get across, because you don't want it to look like an infomercial.
Or a pure campaign, which is slightly different.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
Sort of
yeah. It's a terminology thing,
Yeah.
but yeah.
See, I mean, I don't think that the distinction always is about trying to make a film popular rather than unpopular. In a way, it's about trying to make a film really good. And the judgments I'm making about films are really to do with their quality as pieces of work. You know, you take a film like Chosen, for example, which was Brian Woods' film about sexual abuse.
How many people have seen Chosen? A few. No.
I mean, that film is a grueling watch. As it's just the very straight-to-camera testimonies of three middle-aged white British guys who look like the sort of people you'd sit next to on the tube, talking about the incredible psychological damage of reliving their stories of being sexually abused at school. And that film has a real campaigning element about the fact this still is a problem in schools and what we can do about that. Now, I mean, that film, not an audience grabber, not a ratings grabber, but I mean, a tremendous piece of work which went on to win the Best Documentary BAFTA this year. So, you know, that was a film we were enormously pleased to have just because it was such an effective piece of work. I think there's a difference between issue films and campaigning films. Sometimes, oddly, the most successful campaign films are, in fact, films that just are about the issue, and they don't have a kind of tacked-on, deliberate, self-conscious campaigning element, which you know can be quite a turn-off, and also can be quite bad filmmaking sometimes, not always, but sometimes it can be. And if you get your issue film right, that is often the best way to actually bring people to the campaign. And if you make a sort of brilliant done issue film, then that sometimes is really the best way to do it.
Because in fact, the answer to your question is really, the only answer to your question is make a great film. Because there is no formula. There is no, you know, you just need, you know, everything to fall in the right place at the right time, and you need to, you know, it's about making the best possible film. And that's why I don't get concerned about whether 10 people or 10,000 people watch the films we make. All we try and do is make the best possible film. And then, you know, the rest is up to fate and up to, you know, whether people want to see it or not.
Well, it's an interesting point. When especially the years when I got rid of the commentary in films, I would show them to the commissionaires and anybody else, PAs, ex-secretaries, anyone I could get to see them in rough cut to make sure they understood it. So that the film, so in that sense, if the film is too private, it's I show it to my friends, and that'll be fine. But if we're showing it on television on a mainstream channel like BBC One, you know, you want people to understand it. And I think that's the kind of compromise which some of the editors I worked with thought I was an absolute monster, because it mattered to me that people understood the films. They just said, oh, it's a great film, it's a work of art. But it's more than a work of art. It's on television, it's broadcast, and it's got to reach people. And I want people to change their minds using this evidence. I don't tell them what to think, but I tell them what to think about. Right? So you understand that distinction. It's an important one. I don't think we should apologize for having more people, if possible, watch our films. That's the goal for me. Anyway.
No, but what I think is if you embark and tailor your film to, you know, it's got to find these people, you can end up going down a road.
But if you sell out, of course, if you compromise too much. But what I'm saying is that there's a false dichotomy, in my view, between quality, if you like, and accessibility. And I think if the films aren't accessible, show them at the ICA, fantastic. But you know, it's not. They're not Philistine bastards. Because, well, indeed, that's just one of my favourite places. Yes.
I wanted to, if I could. I wanted to very strongly endorse the point that's coming through about talking about the issue rather than having an explicit zealotry about a film. And there are three areas I want to quickly illustrate this with. First of all, Age of Stupid, which I haven't seen, but I very much want to see, and I've only not seen for being too busy. It's very much in my field. But it's a film that frustrates me because I'm an environmentalist, I'm an environmental campaigner, I work very hard doing that. But The Age of Stupid, because of what I campaign about, is actually a very difficult film for me because it attacks a lot of the people who are on my side. I'm thinking particularly about wind farms. And I think that climate change is a fundamentally important thing. I spend my whole life worrying about it and trying to do something about it, but I'm not in favour of indiscriminate wind farms. So the moral of the tale is, if you talk about the issue rather than saying you wicked people for opposing a wind farm, you're much more likely to get my lot of people to screen it and send it around. Second point, I think that one element which is very important, nobody's mentioned yet, is voyeurism. And let's just briefly touch on a C4 film, Pig Business, which I have seen and I've been involved with helping disseminate. There's a film where it works because it's voyeuristic, because you go into these horrible places where wicked people are doing unspeakable things to pigs, and that will make it popular. It's not the point of the film, but it's a very powerful mechanism. But the third one is the most embarrassing for me. It shows my age, and it also shows my hopelessly upper middle class credentials. When I was leaving school and before I went to university, I was herded in with the rest of my year to see a film made by Barclays Bank during apartheid, as bad as that, about going to university. It was fantastically successful because it was a love story about 3 fresher undergraduates and how they survived their first term at university. And of course, it was the sort of hideous subtext was bank with Barclays and we'll look after you. But the film itself was immensely successful because it was a fantastic, beautiful, compelling story. And you know, I don't quite know what it makes me think about Barclays. I never banked with them, and I disapprove of their involvement in South Africa. But I nonetheless felt that the film was a triumph because it was so good at doing the job it was meant to be doing.
Okay, yes.
Hi. When I was talking to somebody...
Could just wait for the microphone so everyone can hear you, sorry.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was talking, not Mike Lerner, the other guy at Roast Beef once, about Afghanistan. And I was just saying something like, Afghans are different from Pakistanis because they don't play cricket. And he said, oh, well, we're going to change that. And I immediately had this feeling that, you know, Roast Beef are like, they have this cultural imperialist agenda. Maybe, you know, it does look weird that you sink private money, like where, you know, £300,000 on the boy who plays on the Buddhas of Bamiyan. Where does that come from?
Where does the money come from? Sorry.
Yeah, like, you know, who is going to spend that much money?
The Buddhist of Bamiyan was made by 5, wasn't it?
By Phil Grabsky.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, like he put his own money into it, and that kind of made me feel a little odd. It's like, you know, how can you kind of feel as if maybe it's the government that's investing in these films covertly?
What, you mean the British government?
Yeah, the British government.
As a form of cultural imperialism?
Well, a little bit, yeah.
Well, that's true. I'll just clear up the cricket issue. It's just because there is a documentary being made about the Afghan cricket team. So that I'm sure that's where that comes from as a thing.
Interesting.
Afghanistan, we did have a tiny bit of money that came from DFID. They have a film fund that tries to look at developing countries in a different way. But I don't think you can call Afghanistan a culturally imperialist film in any way at all. So, and I don't know about the Buddhist
Sorry, does anybody else want to, Rosie, I'll come to you in a second. Does anyone else want to talk about this? Because I'm thinking it's a very interesting question you've asked. Does anyone else want to talk about the question of cultural imperialism, as it were, in respect to that? I mean, because I will just say one thing. I was the initial producer with Richard Curtis of Comic Relief, okay? And when we were raising money for Africa, in our first one, which probably none of you have only been asked in this room, was an omnibus special about a stage show that was held in the West End. And I also did the Amnesty benefits, which were also films of stage shows. And it was very difficult. In fact, the first film we weren't allowed, I put shots of African children in the end credits, because that was the only reference, apart from a speech by Clive James, I think, about dictatorship. That was a different film, even. We couldn't get the politics into that fundraising. It was a campaigning thing without any content, as it were, campaign content. Now, of course, it's evolved very differently, but it's still arguable, and a lot of people still feel that these celebrities descending on Africa is straight cultural imperialism. And isn't it ridiculous that you need, whether it's Geldof or anybody else, to turn up there before you care about Africa? I mean, there is a real issue there. But on the other hand, we actually, A, raised a lot of money, B, arguably got people interested in it, and you know, it became at least the beginning of a conversation when people weren't interested in Africa at all. And if you've got programs on, I mean, I'm not, I am defending it, but I'm not saying I'm defending it as in you can't criticize it. I'm just saying that's what our thinking was about it. That that to get people engaged with what you're saying, to get people engaged with stuff they think they know about or know they don't care about, is two closed two sets of the same closed mind, not interested. So how do you have to? The game is to get them interested somehow, even if it means bringing in somebody rather improbable to do it. I don't know. Sorry, this is tough stuff actually. I'm sorry, Rosie, you had your hand up.
Yeah, no, hi, Rosie Waterhouse. I'm a freelance journalist, but also teach journalism at City University.
Yeah, it'd be nice if other people introduced themselves too. It'd be good, useful.
This is a shamelessly self-interested question on behalf of my students, right? Who are coming out shortly with MAs, diplomas, degrees in journalism. Many of them now in the multimedia world. They want to do TV. What would you advise? And they also want to change the world. A lot of my students, I teach in investigative journalism. Sorry.
We won't change the world if we can't hear you.
No, okay, well, I'm not good at this, but anyway.
That's the point I was making.
Okay. They're very idealistic students. They want to make good programs. They want to do good journalism. What would you advise them to do? How do they get started? They've all been working on projects. They hope to have screenings, to which I'm sure you'll all be invited. But you know, where do they get their work shown? Where do they go, and do they just go out and make programs and make little films? And what should they do?
So, I don't mean to be rude about this, but in relation to campaigning, how does that fit into the theme?
Because some of them want to change the world, and they have pet subjects that they feel very passionate about.
The question is, how do they change the world by getting into television? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but where do they pitch their work? How do they pitch their work?
Yeah.
How do they get in?
They've got to do both. They've got to learn how to make good films by working with other people that are not necessarily campaigning films, but they've also got to do their stuff on the side and do both together. And be aware that no one's going to watch their films until about 10 years' time. And then they might. If they're lucky.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean... Okay,
I think that there is a shortage of kind of nursery slopes for young filmmakers by comparison with the way things were maybe 10 years ago. I think there are some places where filmmakers can really cut their teeth, sometimes with quite strongly campaigning films. I mean, on Channel 4, we've got the little 3-minute wonder slots. We've also got First Cut, which is a half-hour slot, entirely kind of, yeah, you did both of them. In a way, you're the poster girl for this kind of training approach. Yeah. You really actually come up what we would like to think of as being a kind of talent ladder, and then ended up making it for us again. It is a slippery thing.
Yeah, but Ivana also learned production. Yeah. She didn't just do the film.
That's what I mean. You have to learn to make the films as well as then once you've done that, then you can climb.
Yeah, and I mean, you do tend to find that the more newly out of college people are, the more incredibly reluctant they are to take any kind of guidance. And I think a lot of people have sat in cutting rooms with people making their first film, and if you have the temerity to suggest that maybe they might alter the opening a little bit, they're sort of, this is my film. And then 3 years later, you see these people having kind of become a little bit careworn, having got some of the sharp edges knocked off them, turning into really very, very good filmmakers. But there's so much craft in that. It's a process.
Okay, right, yes.
Hi, I'm Poppy. I'm from the British Film Institute. We've spoken about popularity and we've spoken about audience figures, but that's slightly and subtly different to impact. I'd be interested to know what the panel think about whether or not campaigning films actually make a difference, or the kind of difference that they do make.
And also, I mean, it is interesting, that impact is a measurement in itself. Column inches, AI, and the BBC, so on. It's not just numbers. I'm afraid that's you, Hamish, again.
Well, gosh, I mean, I think that the answer is that certainly not all of them do. But I think that some do. I mean, if I look at the slate of programs we've got coming up, the film that was referred to earlier, Pig Business, I think will make a big difference. It's about factory farming of pigs. And when you see these shots that are basically pig Belsen, it's unbelievable. We're eating the bacon that we're eating is produced in these conditions. And it's absolutely stomach churning. And it does change the way, even if you're not sort of minded to be an already converted animal rights activist, it actually changes the way you feel about the bacon that you buy. high. And I think films can have that absolutely visceral impact. I think also some of the NGOs that we're working with now and some of the campaigners that we're working with now are very good at effectively exploiting the lead up to a transmission and exploiting the long tail of that transmission. And they've got a constituency of people who are interested, who re-show the film in halls and on the internet and so on, and who have, you know, incredible kind of connections with others who are like-minded. And even though some of it may be a bit like preaching to the converted, you do find that these campaigns can have quite a big impact. And one television broadcast of the film provides the kind of tempo that holds the whole sort of marquee up, if that's not too tortured a metaphor.
No, that's good. Yeah, actually, tell us a bit more about the chicken one, for example, that you did that. Did the chicken ones, Tesco stopped, they changed their...
Yes, that's right. Tesco's, as a result of Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall's campaign, Hugh's Chicken Run, they changed the factory farming, the availability of these cheap £1 factory farmed chickens that were available. And so that they actually moved really quite extensively towards free range. I don't know whether there's been a kind of creep back towards factory farmed chickens since, I don't know, but certainly it was undoubtedly a really successful piece of consciousness raising.
Did it also get ratings?
It rated extremely well, yeah.
So that was interesting, that it actually did both. But there are, sorry, there are some films, I don't know, John's sort of given us an example of a film that isn't actually necessarily watched by that many people, but is known by
Age of Stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you go to the Age of Stupid website, you'll see just what an impact it's having, that film is having, and it's pretty remarkable, particularly given the fact it hasn't shown on TV. It's remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, the web has just changed the rules. I mean, have people seen Walmart? How many people have seen Walmart? Right? Yeah, he raised the money for that film $50 at a time on the web, and he's doing that again. You know, so both the funding and the distribution is open to a completely different... yeah, sure.
Can I say on that as well, I don't know if people here do know about Channel 4 BritDoc Foundation, but they're running a thing called Films for Change, and there was actually a whole strategy of outreach that you can go on, and they have courses and they have people that coach. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. People that can help you organise a campaign around the film, so that the film's just one part of a much wider thing. And they definitely have impact, I think. So if they're good. Otherwise, you get fatigued, don't you? You're just like, oh God.
There's an interesting question I'm just going to throw out for all of us, because it's one that I was struggling with, and I said I'd like having the evidence being debated. The Ministry of whatever it was called, but the food one, it was trying to do when GM was being debated, and they tried to get it across. They wanted a debate, so they asked us to make a film about it to provoke the debate. So we made a 20-minute film in which I got 3 scientists, 3 housewives, and 3 farmers. All of whom were on different, agnostic, for and against, to debate GM. And I must have seen that about 40 times, and the filmmaker would have seen it even longer. And at the end of it, I still didn't know what I thought. I mean, I was against GM kind of because on the preventative model, but the arguments were so finely tuned. So the question of what impact would be, that for that I became a sort of GM bore for the next year because I knew so much about it. But I still didn't know quite enough to say it's definitive. You know, it was very interesting that. It just was like an ice pick in the brain, which is what Kafka says the job of fiction is, to put an ice pick in the brain. Yeah, it's nice.
How many people saw The Inconvenient Truth? And then how many people subsequently made any sort of change in the way they live their lives? Seriously?
Yeah.
Right, so you get a sense.
That's a really good example.
You get a sense of the impact.
Yeah, well.
No, well, I mean, it's more than none.
It is more than none, yes.
And that's the point, you know.
Were they good before? Were they quite environmentally aware before?
Well, we don't know. We're just asking the people here. Okay. Yes, there was somebody next to... Sorry, just go. Yeah, sure, just...
Work. It's not just the grassroots impact. Grassroots impact feeds the top-end political decision-making. And the thing with An Inconvenient Truth was, although it was a boring PowerPoint presentation, it was designed by a high-end politician to go talk to the Chinese Politburo.
Yeah, no, that's true.
When you get this space where a kind of momentum is built around a grassroots awareness, whether it's picked up by NGOs or not, it impacts on media. Media feeds, top-end media, tabloid media, the kind of a genie's let out of a bottle that then enables you as campaigners to really pack a political punch So it's
And that is what's exciting about The Age of Stupid, again, is a film where, as I said, Franny has been working with the British government, with the American government, and as I also said, it's not a perfect film, but the issue is up there now, and because of that film, there's stuff that's happening.
Exactly. It's really interesting, that question. Sicko, by the way, is out, you know, up against, I mean, Obama's busy trying to reform the health campaign, but there's a huge, huge PR campaign against it. Because it's got so much momentum. Yeah, well, it's interesting. Sorry, there was somebody next to you who wanted to have their hand up. But okay, yes, yeah.
Hi there. This is for the gentleman on the left.
Can you introduce yourself just?
Yeah, my name is Lisa. I'm just an interested bystander. I'm not in the business or anything.
Great. I'm a member of the audience.
Yeah, I'd just be interested. I've lived here for 8 years, obviously from the U.S. Would it validate what you're doing if a competitor came along, a broadcast competitor, not internet? Because I know, having lived there, there's certain destinations I can go to see these type of films you're all talking about, like HBO would be an example. Would you welcome a competitor as another platform that would be, the perfect platform for some of these folks here?
Well, I suppose the answer to that question is that there still is quite a competitive environment. There already is quite a competitive environment in Britain, notwithstanding what I said about the BBC perhaps having slightly less of an appetite for some of these more pointedly activist films than they did have. I mean, I think competition is always quite a good thing. It tends to drive a market, and it keeps everybody's standards quite high. HBO partner up with us on a lot of the films that we do. Also, PBS do, and sort of worldwide, there's quite a competitive market for broadcasters chase the good films worldwide, and sometimes we have to chase quite hard to get the ones that we really want.
Right, okay, yes, sorry, indeed. Can you introduce yourself again?
Yeah, hi there. I'm Richard Parry. I'm a filmmaker. It's sort of ironic. Sorry?
You're a very good filmmaker.
Oh, thank you. It's kind of ironic because this evening was originally conceived of with a discussion with me and Nick Fraser, and we were both rallying against campaign films. And
well, do you want to go on?
What's that?
This is your chance.
Well, no, I mean, I suppose for me as a filmmaker, the problem is when campaign films dress themselves up as documentaries, and this sort of muddy area. And I think it's fine if you present a film as a campaign film, but when it gets presented as a documentary, and you expect something that's a bit more complex. I think, firstly, it makes a smaller market for us who are in the market of not making particularly a film that has one particular bent. But secondly, I think it's harder for an audience who are expecting something that's more critical.
I think, if I may say so, your definition of campaign is rather narrow. If you want to raise awareness, all those mental health films were trying to raise awareness. They were campaigning to do that, but they weren't narrow, as in you have to think a certain way about them. I mean,
although I must say, I agree with you to some extent that there are sort of three big problems with a lot of self-consciously campaigning films. One is a lot of them really are blunt instruments, like we talked about a little bit before. They're films that have kind of sacrificed some subtlety and complexity of filmmaking quality in order to batter you over the head with a message and just keep on battering you. And the sort of secondary part of that is quite a lot of them get their facts wrong. And really often quite badly wrong. And there's a sort of mindset in a lot of, in certain campaign films that is, as long as we're really delivering the message is so important, it kind of doesn't really matter if we just play it a little bit fast and loose with a few facts here and there, and make a couple of slightly contentious remarks and dress them up as fact. And I think that really is quite problematic. And if it's left unchallenged too much, it's profoundly damaging to documentary. I think the other thing is films made by true believers, if you like, quite often mistake genuine kind of critical analysis for people who are simply not getting with the program. And there is a kind of intolerance about often the filmmakers and their supporters on really campaigning films, where they simply will brook no criticism or discussion of the film. It's kind of just shut your mouth and get with the program. And pay for it, yeah. And I think all these things are quite they can be quite tricky.
And also, I think occasionally, sometimes you get filmmakers who are the campaigners. Often you get filmmakers who are the campaigners, and in fact, they're not filmmakers.
Yes, that's true too.
And so you know, their film will gather momentum, and the more that goes on, the more they feel like they're genuine filmmakers. Truth is, they're not filmmakers, and in some cases, not filmmakers at all. But what I would say is, in the final analysis, unless it's awful, I don't think it matters if you're making a film about something that's important, and therefore, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I don't see it making it harder for other people to make documentaries.
And actually, sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say that I think one of the things that I've seen, because Afghan Star opened me up to a world of films that I didn't really know before, which was the international sort of festival scene and the kind of feature docs around the world. And there are a lot of really dull and not good films in that circuit, because specifically since Inconvenient Truth, especially in America, suddenly loads of NGOs are pouring money into films which they hadn't done before, and it does become quite flat on that.
All I was going to say is the
slightly
British.
different from Britain.
Sure, the British documentary movement was born by people who were campaigning. Right? The Griss and all of those guys were campaigning, and they adjusted reality to fit their vision rather than the other way around. I think, in fact, Grissom attacked me when I started doing observational films. He said, "Where's the film poetry? You know, why are you?" And I said, "Look, I'm letting the film teach me, because I'm asking a question rather than coming with an answer." But he didn't like that at all. And the word documentary, you know, he founded that, so I have to claim that. Yes. Ah. Oh, that was good. You did that on his behalf. Very generous of you. Campaigning.
Hi,
this
thanks.
has got to be
difficult enough campaigning if you can't get heard in a place like this. Matt Malloy, working on Unreported World at the moment.
Hello,
Hi, Roger. I just want to ask the panel. 3 years ago, I heard Franny Armstrong say that there was no place for campaign films. She was struggling to raise money for a film at the time that was called Crude, which obviously changed as it turned out. The reason I want to ask that is because I know you're about to lead on to the effect of the web and what that can do for campaign films. Because at the moment, the BBC are constrained by editorial policy. They're a little bit conservative about campaigning, obviously. Channel 4 is sometimes governed by the commercial imperative. So what is the place? Where is the place for campaigning films? If somebody really wants to make a campaigning film, where does it end up?
John?
Well, I mean, the only answer I can give is that it ends up where it ends up. Not a very helpful answer. The fact is, you've got to, you know, you have to just roll with it. You have to, you know, you have to make it, enable it to play wherever it can and however it can. So, I mean, there isn't a stock answer to that. The fact is, you're right. When we started trying to raise the money for Age of Stupid, we weren't raising any money, but it didn't stop us from continuing to try and make the film. And then when we haven't sold it to Channel 4 and we haven't sold it to the BBC, still doesn't stop us from getting it out there. You just have to be committed and passionate and believe in what you're doing and find the ways and the places to get the film out. I mean, I'm afraid that's the best I can do.
Good. You did say earlier, though, that you're looking for campaigning films.
Well, I think particularly True Stories on More 4, which isn't a slot which is particularly ratings driven. We're not actually obsessed with getting higher numbers in that slot particularly. It's a place for showcasing good campaigning films. And, you know, I mean, there's lots of examples, but, you know, I might cite Jess Search and Rupert Murray's film End of the Line, which is coming up, which is a film about overfishing, which, again, is, in a way, it's like the dream ticket, because it's a self-consciously campaigning film, right down to the web address slapped across the end of the end credits, and the leaflet that's pressed into your hand as you leave the cinema. But it's also a very enjoyable, well-made, quite entertaining film, which kind of changes your view about that environmental issue. And you know, I think all we've got to do is just keep looking for the films that work. You know what I said at the outset about I'll judge a film not on the strength of its campaign, but on the strength of its filmmaking. And if the filmmaking's strong, there's a place for these pieces of work.
And it doesn't just have to be about food, though.
What's that?
Did you finance
Channel 4 BritDoc financed it.
Yeah, no, but that was End of Line also got money from an NGO.
And also from Waitrose subsequently.
Well, but no, exactly. So that was quite a complex funding mix there. Sorry, you've spoken earlier, and I do want to. Chris, do you have a microphone there?
Thank you, Chris Mitchell, lapsed filmmaker. I'm increasingly perplexed by the notion of what a campaigning film actually is. When I saw this event advertised, I thought it was actually films funded by NGOs or partly funded by NGOs. And I'm realizing as the discussion goes on that I actually have no idea at all what a campaigning film is, even more so after Richard's intervention. I mean, I saw Afghan Star. I thought it was a fantastic film, but in no way a kind of crudely campaigning film. I'm sure all of the filmmakers in this room would invest themselves in their work so much when they're making a film that in fact it becomes a kind of campaigning film. When you're making a documentary, you're almost, by virtue of it, you're having succeeded in making it, it's a campaigning film because you're trying to draw attention to the subject that it's about and probably change the world in some way as a consequence. I mean, if you think of a film like, for example, The Lie of the Land by Molly Dineen, that in a sense is a campaigning film.
Yes.
Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
So at what point does authored filmmaking turn into campaigning filmmaking? That's my question.
Yes.
I mean, Afghan Star is not a direct campaigning film at all. It was never meant to be. It was never sold as that in any way. What's happened is that because it is proving to be, people are getting a lot from it and learning a lot from it and understanding the situation is very complicated, that obviously people are dying for every day. It has become a sort of indirect campaigning film. And I know, like now in Kabul, the UN use it. When a couple of weeks ago, the Swedish foreign minister went and was shown the film on his first night. Like it's become influential on that sort of
but
level.
I think
but
we
it's
have to
not
be
directly campaigning.
Yeah, I think we have to be a little more precise if it to be helpful in respect to this.
That's exactly what I mean.
Okay. Well, the point I was trying to make earlier is that if you enter a campaign with evidence, or start a campaign with the evidence, and you want a change that like at least greater awareness, but also towards some preconceived change, that's a campaign. If you just make a film in which you want a lot of people to think about it, I wouldn't have said that qualifies in terms that we're talking about.
So what about most Dispatches films, for example? Are those campaigning films? Or a film by John Pilger?
Now, John Pilger, definitely. Because they're authored and he's got a very clear point of view. If the Dispatches are an inquiry or an investigation, I would have said no. I mean, but they might be. They might be wanting to change, the behavior of racism. It's a campaigning against racism in the police, racism in the army, the treatment of old people in care homes. I mean, those are campaigning films, absolutely. I'm very glad to have been party to make them. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, as preparing for this event, I kind of went through the list of True Stories films that have been broadcast on More 4 in the latter part of this year, of last year and into this year. And some of them you can definitely tick campaigning film, some of them definitely X, not a campaigning film. Most of them fall into the category of sort of. And actually, I don't really have a problem with sort of campaigning films. In some ways, the sort ofs are among the best films. And I don't think you really need a kind of, I don't know if it's particularly useful even to have a particular definition of what a campaigning film is. All films have a point of view, and from my perspective, Channel 4 films feel most at home on that channel when they've got a kind of sense of an argument being made and a point of view being put forward. That's really what I'm after, first and foremost.
Okay, we're just going to have to wind up. I'm being given lots of signals here. So, all right, the lady here, and then the guy in the back who's had his hand up for ages. Let's start. But please be brief, and we'll try and...
Elizabeth Block, Terracotta Films.
Talk into the microphone, Elizabeth. We can't hear you otherwise.
I saw the film that Robert Beckford made about the slave trade. Now, that was a frankly campaigning film. You screened a couple of years ago, did you not? Could you say a few words about that? Because in that film, the filmmaker was on screen, very engaging, and saying, I know you're not going to buy this idea that we should make reparations, we being the UK. I don't know whether there's a similar thing in the States. And then he showed you Liverpool and Manchester and the great buildings, tried to change your mind that this was a good idea, but done with such humor. So I agree with you that definitions are difficult.
Yeah, in that film, he'd kind of turn up at the Liver building or whatever, having told you a little bit about how the history of this building was, that it had been funded entirely on the proceeds of the slave trade. Actually, I'm not sure if it was the Liver building. I'm probably libeling somebody here. But whatever the building was, he was outside. And he turned up and went up to the owners of the building and kind of demanded that they sign this kind of big check that he had with the 11 billion pounds that with interest added, he should now be repaid. And it was a stunning stunt, really, but it was a stunt that really made you think about how much enslavement and the whole slave trade had actually formed the very basis of commercial Britain, and it was, you know, fantastically effective in that way. And in some ways, it wasn't maybe so much a campaigning film as just a brilliant use of a kind of campaigning tactic to make a great history film.
But Mark Thomas's films on Channel 4 have been all campaigning in that sense, aren't they? I mean, if you've got a point of view in that sense, and you're campaigning to share that point of view, I think, you know, sorry, the guy in the back, sorry, yes.
John Conroy. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can, but yes?
What's the difference between a pound that comes from Shell Oil or Diffid or Oxfam? And I ask that because for me, campaign documentaries, and probably most documentaries, are incredibly political. They are a point of view about the world, what you think of the world, and you thought while making the programme. And I remember Martin Durkin, when he was making things like the GM and the global warming programme, was accused of being in the pay of companies and was almost dismissed as a way of dismissing it. And which really showed me how political it is. And also how possibly dissent is a word that I'd look for in campaigning films. Because, to be honest, global warming and campaigning around it almost is in every news bulletin, it's taught in every school. It's like a door that's open already. Whereas I'm interested personally in politics which kicks at doors. And that's why Martin Durkin caused a bit of a stink, because people were like, ooh, this is going to have to make me think about this issue. Can I justify my position or not? For me, that's really important, particularly at a time like now where consensus seems to be the only politics.
Does anyone want to comment on that? I mean, that wasn't really a question, was it, though? No, just one small footnote is that nothing much is likely to happen in Copenhagen, despite all of it.
No, and I think that's quite interesting about, although I agree with what you say, the global warming door may be wide open, but none of us are doing anything about it.
Exactly.
And that possibly is the point of continuing to bang on what I agree is a subject that's been told many times, but that doesn't actually answer the point you're making. But I do think it's important to note in the terms of that cause, yes, the door's open, but no, we are not doing nearly enough about it, all of us, and I think that's incredibly important.
I have to say, I think that's a great note to end on, because, you know, making the film is not changing things. It is the beginning of an effort to change things. The real test is if anything changes. And I brought a little clipping along for those of you who ever saw my rape film 27 years ago, which was supposed to be the only film at that point, apart from Kathy Came Home, that changed the way, you know, anything official. This was yesterday's Times, but you can all read that, right? So I need to make another one, you know, because you mustn't give up. That's really the point. Okay, thanks. Can you please thank Paul Panos?